He had spent the entire drive from Scarborough convincing himself that leaving the job site early was a mistake, that standing in front of a stranger in a restaurant he couldn't afford was an even bigger one, and that his sister Carol meant well but had absolutely terrible judgment when it came to matchmaking. He had no idea the woman he was about to meet for the first time had already seen him at his worst, soaked to the skin, crouched on the shoulder of the Gardiner Expressway, trying to keep a stranger's car from dying in the rain. Connor McGuire gripped the steering wheel of his 2009 Dodge Ram, the same truck he'd owned since his 20s, the same one that had hauled lumber, driven his daughter to every single soccer practice in Mississauga, and once memorably transported an entire kitchen's worth of donated appliances to a women's shelter in Etobicoke. The engine knocked slightly when he pushed past 90 on the highway, something he kept meaning to fix between jobs. At 38, he ran a small but respected residential renovation company, McGuire Build, out of a storage unit in Scarborough that doubled as his office when the weather was bad enough to keep him off rooftops. He was lean, weathered in the way of men who spent their winters outdoors, with calloused hands and a laugh that arrived quickly and without apology. Tonight, he had traded his Carhartt jacket for a wool blazer he'd bought at Value Village 3 years ago for a funeral and had worn exactly twice since. His daughter Lily, who was 7 and unbearably perceptive, had looked him up and down before he left and said, with total sincerity, "You look like a substitute teacher, Dad." He had thanked her, kissed the top of her head, and driven away before she could say anything else accurate. Carol had arranged this. Carol, who had been aggressively monitoring his social life since his divorce finalized 2 years ago, had texted him a name and a restaurant address on a Tuesday and refused to elaborate beyond. "She's real, she's normal, she's not looking for someone to impress her. Just show up. Canoe. 7 o'clock. Don't Google the menu." He had Googled the menu. He wished he hadn't. Canoe sat on the 54th floor of the TD Bank Tower in downtown Toronto, and its prix-fixe dinner started at $220 per person before wine. Connor had $400 in his checking account until Friday. He'd been telling himself for 6 days that he would figure it out when he got there. Meanwhile, 40 minutes across the city, somewhere on the rain-slicked stretch of the Gardiner near the Jameson exit, Harriet Voss was sitting in a dead car with her emergency brake on and her entire carefully managed composure coming apart at the seams. At 41, Harriet was the chief financial officer of Caldwell Meridian, one of Bay Street's most aggressively respected investment firms. She had spent that afternoon navigating a 7-hour board restructuring meeting in which she had calmly and methodically removed 2 underperforming senior partners from their positions while simultaneously approving a bond acquisition that would add $30 million to the firm's Q3 projections. She had done it all without raising her voice once. Her colleagues found this more frightening than shouting. Her closest friend and head of communications, Danny, had ambushed her with this blind date the same way Danny ambushed everything, with research, a printed summary, and the quiet authority of someone who had been watching Harriet work herself into a smaller and smaller life for years. "His name is Connor," Danny had said, sliding a handwritten card across the table during lunch. "He's a contractor. He builds things. He has a daughter he talks about like she's the most interesting person he's ever met. He has 0 interest in Bay Street and absolutely no idea who you are, which, honestly, is exactly what you need." Harriet had folded the card and put it in her coat pocket without comment. She had also 2 days later quietly asked her assistant to check that the reservation was confirmed. She didn't examine why she'd done this. She had decided to drive herself tonight. Her usual car service felt like too much armor for something she was already dreading, and she'd wanted the illusion of control over at least one variable. This had turned out to be optimistic. Her 2021 Volvo, which was under full warranty, and which she serviced religiously at the dealer on Bay, had chosen the Gardiner Expressway in a November rainstorm to stop, not stall, not sputter, stop, as though the engine had made a considered decision and carried it out. She had managed to coast to the narrow shoulder, flipped on her hazards, and then sat very still for a moment. The rain hammered the roof in waves. She had no signal. She was wearing a slate gray theory blazer over a silk blouse that had cost more than her first month's rent at 22, and her heels were not designed for standing on wet concrete in November. She tried the ignition twice. Nothing. Connor nearly missed her. He was running late. Traffic on the DVP had been a mess since the Bloor Street construction spread its chaos another 8 blocks south, and he'd taken the Gardiner as a shortcut, which was always a gamble. His headlights caught the Volvo's hazard lights flickering in his peripheral vision just as he was about to pass the Jameson ramp, and something in his chest, the same instinct that made him double-check scaffolding before anyone went up, pulled his foot off the gas before his brain had fully formed the thought. He pulled over, 50 meters ahead of the Volvo, and sat for a second in the rain. He was already late. He was wearing the Value Village blazer. He had $400 and a maxed-out visa and a reservation at a restaurant where the bread baskets probably cost $25 and looked like they'd been individually blessed. He got out of the truck. The rain was immediate and comprehensive. He jogged back along the shoulder, his blazer soaked through in seconds, and rapped his knuckles on the Volvo's driver window. The woman inside looked at him the way people look at things they're trying to decide whether to be afraid of. He raised both hands, palms out, rain dripping off his nose. I'm just a guy, he said, which was not his most articulate moment but seemed to land. She lowered the window 2 inches. The car's dead, she said. Her voice was even, the kind of even that takes effort. I've tried the ignition. There's no signal. Yeah, the cell coverage on this stretch is terrible. He crouched slightly, trying to see the dashboard through the gap. How long has it been stopped? 12 minutes. He almost smiled at the exactness of that. You mind if I take a look? A pause. She was reading him, he could tell. He'd been read by a lot of people on job sites who weren't sure if they should trust the guy standing in front of them, and he'd learned to just let it happen. The hood release is on the left, she said. He found it, lifted the hood, and propped it with the rod. The rain immediately began hammering the engine bay. He pulled the small flashlight he kept clipped to his keychain, the kind that was meant for reading circuit breakers in dark basements, and started looking. After about 90 seconds, he had a reasonable theory. He went back to the window. Your battery terminals are corroded, he said, the connections intermittent. When the engine got cold and wet, it lost contact. It's a pretty common Volvo thing, actually. They hide the negative terminal under a plastic cover and moisture creeps in. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not skeptical. More like recalibrating something. Can it be fixed here? Temporarily, yeah. I've got a wire brush in the truck. I can clean the terminals enough to get you moving. You'll want to take it to the dealer this week, but it'll get you off the Gardiner tonight. He went to the truck, found the brush and a pair of nitrile gloves in the glove box, and came back. She had gotten out of the car by then, which surprised him. She was holding a large umbrella, dark green, over the engine bay. Rain was soaking her from the knees down, but she was standing there like it was a weather condition she had simply decided to accommodate. You don't have to stand out here, he said. I'm aware. She kept the umbrella level. What are you looking at exactly? He showed her, running the flashlight along the terminal connections, explaining what oxidation does to electrical contact in the cold. She asked 2 precise questions. He answered them. It was, he would think later, the most unexpectedly comfortable technical conversation he'd had in years, and he had no idea who he was having it with. He worked the brush in careful circles over the terminal posts, dried them with the rag he kept in his back pocket, reconnected the cables firmly, and closed the hood. Try it now. She got in. The Volvo started on the first turn. She got back out immediately. Thank you, she said. She said it the way people say things they actually mean, which is different from the way they say things out of obligation. I would have been here for hours. It's a quick fix. He was pulling the gloves off, stuffing them in his jacket pocket. Like I said, get the terminals properly cleaned and sealed when you can. Ask them to check the ground cable too while they're in there. I will. She paused. The rain had softened slightly, a drizzle now instead of a downpour. You're soaked, occupational hazard. He looked down at the blazer. It was genuinely ruined. Carol was going to hear about this. "You're dressed for something," she said. It wasn't a question. "Dinner." He glanced at his watch. 7:40. "I was dressed for dinner. I'm now dressed for whatever this is. I'm also supposed to be at dinner." She tilted her head slightly. "Downtown?" "Yeah, place called Canoe." Something shifted in her face, very quickly. He might have missed it. "Drive safe," she said. "The gardener's terrible past Spadina in the rain. You too." He turned back toward the truck. "Take the surface streets if you can." "Thank you," she said again, quietly, to his back. He raised a hand without turning around, got in the truck, and drove south toward the city. He did not know her name. He did not know that she was already running the same mental calculus he was, that she had looked at a man in a soaked blazer, crouching over an engine in the rain, and thought, without meaning to, that she couldn't remember the last time someone had simply shown up for her without being paid to do so. Neither of them knew they were going to the same place. The elevator to Canoe opened onto warm light and the quiet confidence of an expensive room doing exactly what it was built to do. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the whole of downtown Toronto laid out in the rain, the CN Tower lit red to the south, the lake a dark suggestion beyond the city's edge. Connor felt the room assess him the second he stepped in. He was wet. He was wearing a blazer with a damp shoulder seam coming apart. His boots were Blundstones, which were technically presentable but not what the room expected. "Reservation for McGuire," he said at the host stand. The host, young, impeccably dressed, managed to look at him without quite looking at him and said, "Right this way," in a tone that was technically hospitable. Connor was shown to a table near the window, which was either a compliment or an irony, and he sat down and looked at the menu and felt the particular quiet panic of a man doing math in his head in a very expensive room. He ordered sparkling water. He looked at his phone, 7:52. He thought about texting Carol. He decided against it because she would respond with something encouraging, and he was not in the mood for encouragement. He would give it until 8:15. Then he would find a reasonable excuse and go pick up Lily from his parents' place in Scarborough and eat leftover butter chicken on the couch and call this a story he'd tell someday. At 8:01, the room changed. It wasn't loud. There was no announcement. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the way a room does when someone enters it who is used to rooms changing around them. Heads didn't turn exactly, but attention moved. Connor looked up. The woman from the Gardiner was standing at the host stand. Her hair was dry. She must have had time, or a very good car heater. She was still wearing the gray blazer, still had the posture of someone who had never once slouched, and she was scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of a person who processes environments quickly. Her eyes found him in about 4 seconds. She stopped. He put down his water glass. She walked over slowly, as though her legs were slightly uncertain about what her face had already decided. "You have got to be kidding me," Connor said. Something that might have been a laugh moved across Harriet Voss's face. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. They looked at each other for a moment. "Your sister set this up," she said. It wasn't a question. "Carol." "My sister Carol." He leaned back. "You, my colleague Danny." She paused. "She described you as a guy who builds things." "That's accurate." He looked at her. "She tell you anything else?" "She told me you talk about your daughter like she's the most interesting person you've ever met." "That's also accurate." He watched her. "You knew." "At the car. You heard me say Canoe, I suspected." She met his eyes steadily. "I wasn't certain, but you didn't say anything." "No." He considered that. "Why not?" Harriet looked at him for a moment. "Because you were almost done fixing my car, and I didn't want you to stop." It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a long time. She could feel it in the saying of it, the faint, strange relief of a sentence that was just true. Connor was quiet for a second. Then he said, "The dress code description on this website said smart casual." "It's a polite fiction," Harriet said. "This restaurant has a very liberal definition of smart casual if you're booking a table 6 weeks in advance." He laughed, not politely, actually laughed, which was not what she had expected from the evening. The server arrived. Connor looked at the menu with the careful neutrality of someone playing poker. Harriet, who had spent 20 years learning to read people across boardroom tables, saw it immediately, and without ceremony folded her menu closed. "I've been here too many times," she said before the server could speak. "And honestly, the portions have gotten smaller since they changed chefs. I'd rather go somewhere else." She looked at Connor. "If that's all right with you." "You don't have to. I'm not doing it for you," she said mildly. "I genuinely dislike this restaurant. I only agreed because it was neutral ground." She looked up at the server. "We're going to settle up the drinks and head out. Thank you." They stood on King Street in the November drizzle, and Connor said, "So where do you actually want to go?" Harriet thought for a moment. "Is there a place in this city where you can get a decent bowl of pho at 8:30 on a Wednesday?" He stared at her. "That's what you want?" "I've been in a boardroom since 9 this morning. I want soup, and I want it to be hot, and I want to sit in a booth where no one is watching me." He knew a place on Spadina. They took his truck, which she got into without comment, though she did glance at the coffee-stained dashboard organizer and the stack of building permits on the back seat with an expression of mild anthropological interest. The restaurant was called Pho Co Ba. It was loud and warm and smelled like star anise and bone broth, and the woman at the front waved Connor in by name. "You come here a lot," Harriet observed, as they slid into a corner booth. "My daughter thinks it's the best restaurant in Toronto," he said. "I've been trying to convince her there are other categories of food for about 2 years. How old is she?" "7. Her name's Lily." He pulled off his jacket and draped it over the back of the chair. The blazer was done for. He felt immediately better without it. "She also currently believes that all bridges are held up by magnets and that our neighbor's cat can predict the weather." Harriet's mouth curved. "The weather one might be true. That's what I said." She was very smug about it. The soup came quickly, enormous bowls with a plate of basil and bean sprouts and hoisin on the side. Harriet pushed up her sleeves, squeezed lime into the broth with the methodical efficiency she applied to most things, and took a long first sip directly from the bowl. She set it down. "That's excellent. Told you." She looked at him across the table. In the flat fluorescent light of the restaurant, he looked less like a man playing a role and more like himself. Whatever that was, she was beginning to piece together. There was a small scar on his chin that she hadn't noticed on the Gardiner. His hands were calloused in specific places she recognized as the hands of someone who used tools rather than someone who held a pen. "What do you build?" she asked. "Specifically, residential renovation, mostly. Old houses in the East End that need their bones fixed. Sometimes new builds, but I prefer the old ones." He tore a piece of the accompanying bread without ceremony. "There's more problem solving in an old house. Every one of them has done something weird over 60 years to try and stay standing. I like figuring out what it actually needs versus what someone assumed it needed." She set down her chopsticks. "That's exactly what I do." He looked at her. "With companies," she said, "I come in when a firm's financials look like a sick building. Something's wrong and nobody's quite diagnosed it. I find the load-bearing problem and we fix that first." She paused. "Though in my world, the old beams are usually executives who've been making the same unexamined decisions for 15 years. Do they know you're there to fix them?" "They know I'm there." A dry pause. "They have various theories about why." He looked at her with a directness that she found, unexpectedly, not uncomfortable. Most people looked away from her after a few seconds. They tended to find her easier to address slightly to the left. "Can I ask you something?" Connor said. "Yes, tonight, on the Gardiner. You were alone. You didn't call anyone." She waited. "Who do you call, usually, when something goes wrong?" It was a simple question. It shouldn't have been a complicated one. She'd had 12 minutes sitting in that dead car before he knocked on the window, and she had held her phone and scrolled to her contacts and not landed on a single name that felt right. "My assistant handles most logistics," she said finally. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He didn't push. He went back to his soup. She found that she wanted, oddly, to keep talking. "I built something very efficient," she said quietly, "in terms of a life, very optimized. Everything works. Everything performs." She turned her bowl slightly on the table. but I haven't had a conversation that surprised me in about 3 years, until you explained to me what a corroded battery terminal was doing to my engine in the rain. That's a very low bar, Connor said. I know. I'm a contractor telling you about corrosion on the side of the highway. I know. She looked at him. It surprised me anyway. They stayed in the restaurant until well past 10. They talked about the building she'd grown up in. A duplex in Hamilton, her father a civil engineer, her mother a high school French teacher, both of them deeply practical people who had looked at her talent for numbers early and pointed it like an arrow. They talked about his renovation of a 1940s wartime house in Leslieville that had taken 8 months, because it turned out the original builder had done something structurally creative with the load-bearing walls that Connor described as genuinely inspired but technically insane. They talked about Lily, about the particular specific difficulty of raising a perceptive child alone, about the way grief worked when it was ambiguous, not death but departure, not loss, but the slow redrawing of what a life was supposed to look like. He hadn't talked about this to anyone. He noticed that. He also noticed that she listened the way few people did, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. When they finally walked out onto Spadina, the rain had stopped. The street reflected the streetlights in long orange lines across the wet pavement. I parked on the Gardiner, Harriet said. I'll drive you back. They sat in the truck outside her building in Rosedale. She'd given him the address, explained the car situation, and he'd simply driven without making anything of the neighborhood, which she noticed, and she sat for a moment with her hand on the door handle. Connor? Yeah, thank you. For stopping. On the highway. You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again. She looked at him. For the other thing. He didn't ask what the other thing was. He nodded. She got out, walked to her front door without looking back, which was how she always left things. It was only inside, coat still on, standing in her dark front hall, that she realized she didn't have his number. 3 days later, Connor was in the site office, which is to say, he was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the renovation job in the Beaches, with a coffee going cold in the cup holder, looking at a letter from the city of Toronto that had arrived that morning. The building permit on his largest current contract, a full-gut renovation on a Victorian semi that he'd been counting on to carry Maguire build through the first quarter, had been flagged for a zoning discrepancy. The permit was suspended pending a heritage review. Conservatively, 3 months of delay. Possibly 6. The client was already texting. He had a line of credit that would cover 1 month of payroll and materials if he was careful. After that, he would have to let his crew of 4 go, possibly longer. He'd been doing the math since 7 that morning, and it kept coming out the same way. Lily had a swimming lesson at 5. He was not going to figure out the rest later. He put the letter in the glove box, finished the cold coffee, and climbed up to the second floor to help his site lead with the subfloor. At 2 in the afternoon, he heard a car pull up that didn't sound like the supply delivery he'd been expecting. He looked out the window opening, the windows weren't in yet, and saw a gunmetal gray Volvo parked at the curb. New battery terminals. Harriet Voss was standing on the sidewalk in a camel coat, looking up at the building with the evaluative expression of someone reading a balance sheet. He came downstairs. How'd you find me? He said. I called Danny. Who called Carol? She was still looking at the building. Your crew does good work. The structural repair on the front face is clean. Thanks. He waited. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she always seemed to, without preamble, without the social millimeter of warm-up that most people needed. I have a problem, she said. Okay. Caldwell Meridian maintains a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across the GTA. 11 buildings currently in various stages of renovations or retrofit. Our existing contractor, national firm, very large, has been consistently overbilling, under-delivering, and last week I found out they've been using non-compliant materials on 2 of the sites. She reached into her bag and produced a folder. I need a contractor who is meticulous, who actually understands old buildings, and who is not going to treat the relationship as a billing exercise. Connor looked at the folder. He did not touch it yet. Tori, he said, then stopped. Sorry. Harriet. No one calls me that, she said. Danny calls me Harry, which I also tolerate. You can decide. Harriet. He looked at her. I'm not taking a handout. I know you're not. Her voice was matter of fact. I looked at your work. I found the Leslieville Victorian. I spoke to the owners. I looked at the site documentation. You are exactly the level of competent that I need for what I'm managing, and the contract terms are market rate, not charity. She paused. The slightest thing moved in her expression. Also, the retainer for signing is structured to be available within 72 hours of execution, which I understand may be relevant given recent complications with permits. He stared at her. How do you know about the permit? It's public record. I checked this morning. She held the folder out. Look at it. Don't sign it today. Have a lawyer look at it. Call me when you've decided. She placed a business card on top of the folder. He took both, looked at the card, then looked at her. You drove to the beaches to deliver a folder. I was in the neighborhood. A brief pause. I was not in the neighborhood. He laughed and she let herself smile, and the site foreman leaning out the upstairs window had the decency to pretend he hadn't heard any of it. Lily has swimming at 5, Connor said. I have to leave at 4:15, then I'll go, she said. She turned toward her car, then stopped. Connor. Yeah, I asked Danny to get your number, she said without turning around. She said I should ask you for it myself, which is apparently something people do. He took out his phone. He read her the number. She put it in her phone without looking up. I'm better at buildings than I am at people, he said. I'm better at numbers than I am at either, she said. We might be fine. She got in the Volvo and drove away. Connor stood on the sidewalk in the November light, holding a folder that would solve his immediate problem and a business card with a number that might solve something larger and less easily named. He thought about Lily, who built things out of whatever was in front of her and trusted, with the complete confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned not to, that they would hold. He thought about what his father had told him when he started the company, that the best renovations were never the ones that changed everything, but the ones that found out what was already strong and built carefully around it. He put the card in his breast pocket, climbed back up to the second floor, and went back to work.